Excellencies, distinguished guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, everyone. We will start now. We have two tight sessions in the morning. First on the geopolitics, and then with the coffee break in between, and then geoeconomics. You know the title of the dialogue, the conference today, on ASEAN-China. We're looking at ways of surviving in today's world and being in this neighborhood. We have to look at ways to work together in Southeast Asia, but also together with China. Let me first start with the opening remarks from the Dean, Ajahn Prakorn Sri Prakop, the Dean of the Faculty of Political Science. ISIS is under him, so he will lead off. Ajahn Prakorn.
Okay, thank you so much, Ajahn Thitinan. Sawadee everybody. Okay, welcome to the Jampot Pantip, room. At this building, actually, the ISIS, regularly organizes a seminar in this room. And welcome to the faculty as well. Here is my welcoming remarks. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone and to open this strategic dialogue and public forum on ASEAN and China over the next decade. When the topic of this forum was conceived, there was already the news about the Trump administration's bold capture of former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife in January. In the interim, we now have the Iran war after the United States and Israel's launched a joint attack on the theocratic regime on February 28. Against the backdrop of the U.S. geostrategic posture under the National Security Strategy 2025 and National Defense Strategy 2026, the Maduro gambit and the Iran gamble are consequential for us in Southeast Asia and Thailand. It feels like the world is being turned upside down and the rules-based international system is no longer working. If the US will be preoccupied in its own neighborhood from Greenland to Cape Horn and distracted by the Middle East wars, how should its allies and partners elsewhere adjust, particularly those in ASEAN? As protectionism and geo-economic competition intensify, the race between US and China for chips, critical minerals, and technological edges will likely heat up. National economies everywhere must find ways to adjust by securing markets, diversifying and reconfiguring supply chains, moving up the values ladder whenever and wherever they can. While the US refocuses on petrol and other fossil fuels, China and some other countries continue to build on their green transition and renewable energy. What and how can China and ASEAN do together to address common geo-economic challenges and promote cooperation and collaboration in trade, liberalization, green transition, and share prosperity in an adverse global environment? These are some of the questions that we are concerned with. As we will hear this morning, the US focused on the Western Hemisphere, and now its world choice on Iran may alter the geostrategic landscape in the Indo-Pacific. ASEAN and Thailand within, it will have to find ways to work on managing risk and sharing prosperity through trades and investment with China. ASEAN member states have no choice but to do more with China as the US becomes increasingly unreliable. This morning, we have two panels focusing on both geopolitics and geoeconomics. Between them, we will have a short coffee break. Please be prepared to keep time as we want to make this event concise, constructive, and truthful. I want to sincerely thank our Chinese experts who have spared their time and travel from China to be with us today. And of course, I also want to thank all of our local speakers as well. Let me now turn the floor to Ajahn Thitinan. And thank you very much for coming to the Faculty of Political Science today. ขอบคุณครับ
Thank you very much, Ajahn Prakorn. So taking the cue from the Dean, I'm going to introduce speakers one by one. First session is the geopolitics of ASEAN-China, geopolitics of the world, really. And I think we're looking at the premise here is that if the US is doing what it's doing, aggressively doing this and that, how do we manage, how do we live in this world? Does that mean that ASEAN, Southeast Asia, Thailand have to find ways to work with, to manage, navigate relations and share prosperity with China. Our first speaker, I want to just take a minute to introduce Ambassador Robert Godek. Ambassador Robert F. Godek recently retired from the State Department. He was previously ambassador in Tunisia, Kenya, and then Thailand. And we're very happy to have him residing in Thailand now and joining us. I think, would this be the first engagement after retirement? And Ambassador Godek is the most senior in the US system before his retirement, having been in the Foreign Service for more than 4 decades, I think. And that's really something. So we're very honored and privileged to have him at a nicest public forum like this. And he'll share his views. I think he has some prepared remarks. It doesn't have to be about ASEAN, China, anything you want to say, Ambassador Godek, for the next 15, 20 minutes. We have some flexibility. I also want to draw audience participation. So after the speakers present their remarks, you can also engage and raise questions and pose comments. Please, Ambassador Godek.
Thank you very much, Ajahn Titanan, and it's great to be here this morning. It's wonderful to see so many colleagues and friends, and it's particularly special for me to be here at Chula and in Bangkok, Thailand. This is a truly remarkable country and amazing people, and I will say that my wife Lori and I are very pleased, privileged that we're able to live here for a time. This morning, I want to speak briefly about the international system, rupture, reform, and rebuilding. As all of you are aware, a lot is happening in the international system. Across the globe, people are talking about it. It is, I think, entirely appropriate and important that this discussion happen here, too, in Bangkok, just as it is across Southeast Asia and across the globe. For the past 80 years, the international system created after 1945 was characterized by rules, institutions, and a measure of cooperation. It was not perfect. It did not prevent all conflict, but it did something historically remarkable. It prevented direct global war between major powers. It banned wars of territorial conquest and reduced conflicts generally. Since World War II, there have been fewer than 10 wars for territorial conquest. Contrast that with more than 150 such wars in the 100 years prior to World War II. Now, this achievement alone distinguishes the post-war order from the catastrophic first half of the 20th century and the centuries before it. Beyond helping keep the peace, the system brought growing global prosperity with a trade regime that lifted millions out of poverty. It improved our global response to disease and pandemics. It allowed us to build a stronger, better system of transport, finance, and communication across the world. Fundamental human rights became a focus of more attention. Now, the system had many flaws, of course. The Cold War divided the globe. Great powers still acted outside the rules, and other countries sometimes suffered. Proxy wars devastated countries. Genocides took place. Development inequalities persisted. But on balance, the international system brought a measure of stability that helped make the world broadly safer, more predictable, more prosperous. The planet and the lives of people generally were better. Today, however, the international system, with its strengths and weaknesses, is no longer stable or predictable. It has ruptured. Former red lines have been crossed. Now, there are many reasons for this, but most importantly, the great powers, or hegemons, now use military and economic power in ways that challenge the system. And the goal is simple: domination and control. Russia has challenged the system violently, most notably through its attack on Ukraine. China, too, has undermined the system while signing international agreements and joining international organizations. In practice, it has never accepted key underlying principles. And of course, most recently, the United States has begun to directly challenge and undermine the system that previous US administrations had a role in building. What started as fragmentation has become rupture, and the pace is accelerating. For the middle powers of the world, including Thailand and the states of ASEAN, this moment is not theoretical. It's real, it's structural, and it's consequential. Let me say very briefly a little bit more about the challenges. First, Russia. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an explicit rejection of territorial sovereignty principle embedded in the UN Charter. It's classic revisionism, an attempt to alter borders and restore control and domination through force. Beyond Ukraine, of course, Russia has acted across the globe to attack and assassinate opponents and destabilize the international order in other ways. Now, Russia is not a rising economic power. By most measures, it's a middle power. Significant military capabilities and nuclear weapons, but a middle power. Yet declining powers can be destabilizing. And we've seen before that dissatisfied countries take risks precisely because they perceive decline. Despite Russia's evident wish to restore Tsarist or Russian hegemony over its neighbors in Europe and beyond, the danger is not that it will dominate the system. The danger is that its actions make territorial aggression a foreign policy option. If borders can be redrawn by force, then a foundational principle of national sovereignty in the post-World War II system is finished. For other countries, particularly those without nuclear weapons, the precedent is deeply destabilizing. Alone, Russia could not cause a rupture of the international system, but it's been an important contributor. Second, let me say a word about China. Now, China's challenge to the international system is both more subtle and more consequential. In the past 3 decades, China has become a global power with military capability. It is now deeply integrated into the world economy as an exporter and a center of manufacturing. China has benefited from the international system, joining the WTO and growing rich through trade. China has also played an increasing role in the United Nations and multilateral institutions and agencies. But China has also posed a fundamental challenge to the very system that it used to lift itself out of poverty. China's use of extensive state subsidies, opaque regulatory practices, controlled exchange rate, industrial policy, are a clear rejection of the WTO rules and the principle of free trade. Meanwhile, China's investments abroad have often been far less beneficial than promised. China has challenged the rules around national borders and sovereignty, for example, by making territorial claims and building military bases in the South China Sea. It has sought, through its aggressive actions and threat of military force, to expand its sphere of control. China has also launched a series of proposals to reorder and rewrite the international system. Now, these initiatives include language that sounds positive, but which is in fact quite vague. And the initiatives would do little to really benefit people. Rather, they would serve the interests of the Chinese Communist Party and authoritarians generally. They would undermine fundamental rights and freedoms across the globe. And third, of course, the United States. The United States was, of course, at the center of building the international system. It shouldered a major part of the burden in sustaining it. And in doing so, it benefited greatly. In President Trump's first term, and with accelerating speed in his second, the United States government has sought to rewrite the rules of the international system. Under President Trump, the United States has imposed unilateral and unpredictable tariffs. It sought control of Greenland, to pressure Canada to become the 51st US state, and to take back the Panama Canal. It used military action in Venezuela to remove President Maduro. And the United States commenced a war against Iran and killed Ayatollah Khamenei. I do not, and no one should, mourn the death of Khamenei, who was a brutal dictator leading a monstrous regime. But the United States, working only with Israel, undertook this war of choice alone, and people around the world will bear the consequences. Now, to be clear, President Trump and the US administration have have identified real flaws in the international system. Trade asymmetries, institutional stagnation, including a UN that got far too little done, and uneven burden sharing on defense. Global reform was and is long overdue, but reform requires trust, predictability, coalition building, and institutions. Instead, we've gotten unilateral and unpredictable tariffs, war and threats of war, actions to undermine alliances, and policy volatility. US policy is now clear. Foreign policy is clear. America first. Other countries must do as the United States wishes. They do otherwise at their peril. So the international system is under pressure from the world's major powers. And the underlying message is might makes right. This change has taken place even as the world in the past 20 years faced growing challenges, including a pandemic, climate change, regional wars, and economic crisis. So now what? The question is not whether the post-1945 order will return. It will not. Some have suggested that the tumult in the system may mark the emergence of multipolarity, a system where power is shared, at least among the great powers. But multipolar systems are not stable. They require the major powers have a minimum set of shared understandings and boundaries, and that does not exist today. Others have argued that perhaps the Trump administration is an aberration. They hope that in 2028, Americans will elect a president who restores support for the international system. Maybe, but no one should count on it, and it will not change the reality that the system needs reform. Canadian Prime Minister Carney, in a widely welcomed speech in Davos, made clear the international system brought benefits, but it was always partly false. And Carney called for action by countries, middle powers in particular, to build something better, stronger, and more just. And Carney's voice is now one of many rightly calling for change. So today, right now, it's time to rethink the international system, to begin real reform and rebuilding. In doing so, however, we must acknowledge the extraordinary challenges ahead. This will be hard and take time. At best, progress will be incremental. The last major reform happened only after a world war, and we must not wait for another war to make the changes the world needs. We should begin with a focus on key principles. These should include, first, respect for national sovereignty. Territorial aggression must be rejected. It's also time to resume the conversation begun after World War I, and which advanced after World War II, about the limits on the behavior of nations. Second, protection for fundamental human freedoms and rights. We need a way to respond effectively to genocide and other gross abuses that take place. Third, revitalized trade rules and institutions. Free trade is essential for economic progress and development. As we do so, we must also address the problems of state capitalism, protectionism, and markets closed by unfair rules. Fourth, strengthen global health and climate governance. The pandemic and climate change demonstrate that the very existence of humanity can be threatened. A global response, a global threat demands a global response. Finally, improved international institutions. Real reform of the United Nations is essential. That includes the Security Council. In a world where the largest powers are pursuing their own interests and the bonds of trust have been broken, how does real reform begin? The answer is with the middle powers, the other countries that have a big stake in what is happening. Historically, middle powers can play a transformational role. Now, as I said, for ASEAN, this moment is deeply consequential. The growing systemic instability is damaging Southeast Asia, including Thailand, after decades of progress. ASEAN has long promoted the doctrine of centrality and positioned itself as a convener. To varying degrees, it is sought to hedge or balance among larger powers. Hedging works when major powers are constrained to some degree. It becomes far more difficult when the hegemons use power without restraint. When sovereignty is no longer respected, trade is a weapon, and alliances are unbalanced, then hedging becomes precarious. ASEAN economic clout and strategic location, however, give it options. ASEAN can play a catalytic role. It can help shape a new international system, one that is better, stronger, and more just. Thailand, notably, has a history and a culture that could help it shape and drive powerful reforms. Leading change will require wisdom, initiative, creativity, and entrepreneurship, attributes the countries of ASEAN have. Change will require working together, along with other middle powers, and also engaging with the larger powers too. This is not about going it alone. This does not mean the countries of ASEAN should abandon critical security partnerships with the United States or trade with China, for example. It's about forging a new international path that puts principle before threats and coercion. Finally, the task of reform falls not just to governments and foreign ministers. Universities, business, civil society, everyone should engage with ideas, energy, and commitment. The alternative is a world with wars of conquest, the collapse of cooperation, and growing poverty. To quote one of my own country's founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, we must indeed all hang together, or assuredly we shall hang separately. The post-1945 system is ending. It is fragmented because it was not delivering. It ruptured because the world's most powerful countries concluded they're better served by the use of raw power to advance their interests. All of us here and across the globe have a profound interest in what comes next. We must do more than hope for the best. We must act. The task before Thailand, before ASEAN, before middle powers, before all of us, is not to defend the fading order. It's to build the next one, deliberately, collectively, and with clarity of purpose. A fundamental rupture has taken place. The era of relative stability is over. The work of reform and rebuilding must begin. The time to be bold is here. Thailand and ASEAN can play a leading role if they choose to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Godek. I think that's really a kind of a keynote that we will share, if you don't mind, with students and so on. You know, we teach international relations around here, and it's really a kind of a concise summary of what's going on in the world, you know, international relations kind of fashioned. I just want to tease out 3 quick points that you raised. I think the system, you call this international system, which is my term of preference. It's not an international order. You say international order, you go to South Asia, they reject that. So international system is what we have to deal with. You also mentioned the inherent instability of the multipolar system. I think that's a really good point. You know, we talk about multipolarity, but in fact, it's not so stable. And then the call on the middle powers in ASEAN and Thailand to build a new kind of system based on the reform of what we've had over the last 80 years. Thank you very much, Ambassador Godek, and we want to hear more from you in the Q&A and so on. Let me proceed now to the next speaker. Dr. Pongpisut Busabarat is the director of ISIS Thailand. He's actually the director of this institute. I'm a senior fellow. Sometimes we exchange, we trade hats. Sometimes, you know, when you moderate, you don't get to present your own views. So sometimes he does that and I do this. And so today he's going to present his own views. He's a speaker. He's also the assistant dean. He's also the non-resident fellow at the Carnegie China. Very accomplished scholar, author, and he's going to give us a bit of an ASEAN view. You know, does this mean that ASEAN will be, I mean, of course, more vulnerable, but how does ASEAN live now? It's divided from inside, on Myanmar, on Russia-Ukraine, on Thai-Cambodian conflict, on the South China Sea, on US-China, divided. even though ASEAN insists on being a central player, a central role in regional security and stability and prosperity, but that centrality now I think has been eroded. Yet, it's the only, one and only agency for Southeast Asia. Without ASEAN, we would be worse off. With ASEAN, we're very frustrated. So what do we do, Ajahn Paul?
Thank you very much, Ajahn Thitinan, and thank you for putting me in this panel with this professional and academic expert. As an ASEAN person, actually I proposed last night I should be the last one after Team 5, but then he's like, well, as an ASEAN person, I'd probably hedge against both both powers, so I should be in the middle. So let me give you like my short assessment in 3 dimensions. So probably I'm going to briefly give you like the layout of what's happening in terms of like geopolitical development in the Trump administration, and then putting that into U.S.-China relations and how it affects ASEAN, and then suggest some policy suggestions to at the end of my presentation. So my first observations about U.S.-China relations under the Trump administrations, perhaps as the early 2026 this year, the Trump administration's approach to China has evolved into a distinct Trump Point 2 framework. While initial months, were marked by the return to aggressive protectionist policy, the relationship has shifted, if you have observed in the past couple of months, toward a highly personalist and transactional G2 dynamic. And you probably have heard that Trump was proposing, ASEAN, U.S. and China should work on the G2 framework. So if you look into this Trump approach to world politics, and you probably could see the highly transactional approach. The second Trump has largely abandoned ideological and normative coalition buildings against perceived threat against the United States, including Russia, Iran, we have seen at the moment, and including China in the larger extent. So moving toward in favor of the aggressive transactional deal maker. So it relies on, from the beginning onward, it relies on the weaponization of tariff. You can probably see he was trying to put tariff as the bargaining tools from 100 to 200 from in the beginning, and then reduce depending on his own personalities and the mood at the moment at the same time. So you probably could see the second one of the geopolitical change in the sense that there's extreme volatility punctuated by episodic détente between the U.S. and China. The bilateral relationship widely, volatile and fluctuating between the intense hostility in the beginning and sudden leader level truces, in the late last year until now. Because largely the foreign policies of the U.S. administration now is driven by President Trump himself, right? Personal impulses, and relations are highly unpredictable in many ways. So you probably could see the way in which the Trump administrations put the abrupt tariff threat against China in the beginning, and then now changed his tone, toward framework agreement, 90-day tariff pauses, or even call for China and the United States to stabilize the trade relations. Now, you could probably see the effect more in the more softer tone after Busan summit, that kind of transactional stabilization. So after the rough years, after the Liberation Day, the relationship has entered a period of relative strategic calm. And you probably could see the shift solidified by the truce in Busan, October 2025. And then now both leaders agree on a 1-year cooling period. And you probably see Trump, kind of jump onto this foreign policy, making head in China policies of the United States. You probably see the change in the strategic tone in the national security strategy this year, it has been softened. A lot of analysts probably observed that has been softened, and moving the tone or narrative away from calling China as the pacing threat, right? More toward cooperative, if not competitive. So as I was mentioning, he was suggesting G2 framework ahead of his scheduled visit to Beijing the late of March of this year. So in short, we can probably see uncertainties loom large in geopolitics, and at a certain point, unpredictabilities in the U.S.-China relations, depending on how Trump thinks about China at certain contexts. So that brings me to the second part of my interventions, how these uncertainties have affected ASEAN's ability to navigate U.S.-China relations. What kind of key policy problem that ASEAN in this context of U.S.-China competition is. So the first policy challenge that ASEAN probably has been facing is the economic vulnerabilities to U.S. coercion and supply chain shock. So Southeast Asia is heavily exposed to Trump's transactional trade policies, facing threat of reciprocal tariff up to 49% in the beginning, and of course it reduced to around 20% on average last year, toward the end of last year, especially after the Cambodia-Thailand conflict truce. Furthermore, as manufacturing shift to ASEAN under the China Plus One strategy, the region faces intense pressure to align with the U.S. economic security regulations. So now the U.S. look at the regions as where the cheap manufacturing products transshipped from China and then sold in the U.S. with a cheap price and competing with the local products. So Washington demands concessions on export control and investment screening, making ASEAN market access to the U.S. inherently conditional and vulnerable. So important, this influence the South China Sea issue as well. If you look into the larger and broader dimensions within this geoeconomic and geopolitical issues. So the current administration has increasingly framed South China Sea issue as economic and navigation issue rather than a sovereignty-based one. The shift has led the fear that U.S. shift of the policy might trade away maritime interest in exchange of Beijing's cooperations on the U.S. trade deficit or other issues. So the second observation of ASEAN's problem within this geopolitical shift is that the erosion of ASEAN's centralities and cohesion that Ajahn Thitinan was mentioning. So Trump lacked a coherent regional strategy, and his preference for bilateral transactional diplomacy actively undermine ASEAN as a unified bloc. So as Trump acts as his own China desk officer, so basically everything is coming from his own mind, the traditional role of the ASEAN summit as a neutral platform and ground for superpower diplomacy has diminished. The G2 dynamic, I would reiterate, effectively bypassed, at least the multilateral platform in the regions. Trump even demonstrated his intervening role in dealing with conflict in ASEAN, right? You probably see toward the end of last year during the Thai-Cambodia conflict. So because U.S. tariff pressures are applied country by country specific, so ASEAN government have defaulted to fragmented self-help strategies, undercutting their collective bargaining powers. So this compounded by the U.S. deprioritizing traditional Southeast Asian security concerns in favor of Western Hemispheric ambitions, whether or not you would call it Donroe doctrines, leaving the regional state uncertain about Washington's long-term commitment. So that brings me to the third dimension of ASEAN's problem within this context is that it deepens asymmetric reliance on regional powers, especially China, while the U.S. slashes vital development assistance to many countries, including in Southeast Asia, and withdraw from climate initiatives like the Just Energy Transitions Partnership. China is filling this gap very quickly through economic integrations and non-traditional security cooperations that China has been having with the Southeast Asia for quite some time. So China is currently ASEAN's largest trading partners and a major source of FDI through initiatives like Belt and Road Initiative is still going on, including those infrastructure-linked, and emergency recovery loans. So you can probably see more role of China within this context. However, these create an economic dependence that will limit some ASEAN states' ability to bargain, as well as frequently paralyzing the bloc from reaching consensus on critical geopolitical issues, such as unified positions on South China Sea. So these bring to my last interventions on the after we try to understand this geopolitical context and how ASEAN get affected within this context. So what kind of the policy recommendations that we could put forward? The first one, perhaps we have to navigate the transactional U.S. policies when dealing with personality-centric U.S. administration. ASEAN perhaps needs to diversify engagement, right? Don't focus just on the White House, right? Engage heavily on with the other stakeholder in the United States, for example, Congress or state-level government, big states that have, like, for example, like energy supply, California or Texas, where long-term economic interest remains more stable. Probably ASEAN has to offer some win set to offer to the United States, frame every regional cooperation project as a win for American jobs and securities. Transactional diplomacy rewards those provide most immediate visible benefit to the partner domestic agenda. So that would probably kind of stabilize ASEAN-US relations in the short term or medium term. The second one is to institutionalize neutrality plus and leverage middle powers, as you were mentioning, and Ambassador Godek was mentioning about the role of middle powers. So ASEAN agencies need to be reactivated and empowered to have more room for maneuvering. ASEAN states should continue to actively exercise neutrality plus strategy, a proactive, adaptive, inclusive form of hedging that firmly reject taking side while maximizing developmental and security partnership. So to buffer against US-China bipolarities that might emerge in the future, ASEAN must deepen strategic and economic engagement with other middle powers like Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, and the EU. So these middle powers can provide alternative choices or resource or sources of investment, technology and security cooperation without polarizing baggage of superpower expansionism. The third one is to strengthen intra-regional economic resilience and collective bargaining. So ASEAN must address internal divisions caused by asymmetric reliance on great power by accelerating its own internal economic integrations. So by strengthening regional supply chains and addressing developmental gap that ASEAN still has, right, between new and old member ASEAN, ASEAN can insulate itself from coercive economic machinations of the US and China. So politically, ASEAN member must resist the temptations of fragmented bilateral deals and commit to joining the multilateral negotiations as a unified bloc. Utilizing ASEAN-led platform like EAS, East Asia Summit, or ADMM+, to bridge, buffer, and enmesh both superpower into regional platform and norms. In this juncture with the US framing South China Sea as a navigation economic issue rather than sovereignty ones, so ASEAN must push for the binding COC as soon as possible. Actually, the Philippines is expecting to finalize this COC by the late 2026. So this creates a legal flow for China to interact with ASEAN that doesn't rely on the presence of United States carrier strike capability or military helps. So by strengthening economic integration within ASEAN, it will make the region too expensive for conflict. While ASEAN may lack capacity to directly control the behavior of the superpower within this geopolitical conflict, it can pose a strong deterrent by deepening regional economic integrations. So simply put it, ASEAN must act as a rule maker rather than a rule taker. So by prioritizing developmental needs of its member states and making ASEAN market as indispensable sources of prosperity, the bloc can make the regions economically too expensive or a risk for U.S. and China to escalate the conflict within this region. So I think this is my first intervention, and we could probably have a conversation after this. Thank you.
Thank you very much ครับอาจารย์พออาจารย์คงที่สุด I just teased out that a lot of highlights from your presentation, but about G2, you mentioned G2. ASEAN doesn't like G2. I think ASEAN likes some tension, some conflict short of war between U.S. and China. If there's a G2, it's actually bad for ASEAN. We're very anxious about the Trump and Xi Jinping summit coming up at the end of the month. And it looks like Trump is taking a softer approach, so we will see about that. Another point you mentioned about ASEAN, I think, is really worth mentioning how the playbook, you have to use a playbook that caters, that addresses, that can deal with the Trump approach, the transactional approach. So you have to somehow come across as providing some kind of a win for the U.S. Businesses, U.S. economy, something for ASEAN to think about. And then finally, about rule making. ASEAN has played a part in a rule-making context. If you're not a rule maker and you're a rule taker, it's like what Mark Carney said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So that's something that ASEAN has to think about. I want to now move on to our Chinese expert scholar, Dr. Ji Xianbai. He has come from Beijing. We're very happy to have him. He from this Bangkok Public Forum, moving on to a dialogue in the U.S. On Track 2 dialogue in preparation for the Trump and Xi summit. And so he has a lot of ideas to share. Also, I'm happy that he got his passport back in order for him to travel here, because he got the U.S. visa, but he didn't have the passport back at the last minute. He was able to get the passport on yesterday or the day before yesterday, and flew yesterday. So very happy to have you with us, Dr. Ji. I'll just say he is the director. You have that bio. I just mentioned his title. Director of the Institute for South and Southeast Asian Studies under the School of Global and Area Studies, and also associate professor at the School of International Studies at Renmin University. Renmin University is in Beijing, and he's written books and articles and so on. Dr. Ji, you're going to discuss this week about U.S.-China and in preparation for the summit. I noticed that the Chinese position on the Iran war, very measured, very mild. The statements, didn't really condemn. The one condemnation, the rest is just criticism. The first statement after the attack was really just expressed that China is highly concerned, right? That's all. And then moving forward, is there a kind of a détente rapprochement, a G2 accommodation? Will there be a geostrategic accommodation now, Dr. Ji, between in a medium term between the presidency and President Trump in view of the Busan summit and at the end of this month the summit in Beijing? Dr. Ji.
Thank you, Dr. Titinan. So first of all, I want to thank the organizers, ISIS Thailand, FES, for bringing me to Bangkok. This is my first experience with Chulalongkorn University, and thank you very much. As Dr. Titinan has mentioned, I just flew in from Beijing. I teach at Renmin University of China. Renmin University of China is the first major university established by the Communist Party of China itself. Although we enjoy a very intimate, very close, and very special relationship with our government, I'm not part of the government. I don't speak for our government, and what I'm going to say are just my personal views. Right? So, as the title, right, Dr. Titinan mentioned Iran and China's response to the Iran has been very nuanced, very measured, very restrained, and so is China's response to what happened in Venezuela in relation to absolute resolve. So actually, I think the title of our discussion today is on Western Hemisphere, Europe, and Indo-Pacific. And I think Western Hemisphere and Indo-Pacific, these two terms, have gained prominence in regional geostrategic, geopolitical, and geoeconomic discourses in recent years. And actually, for Indo-Pacific, Indo-Pacific expands the long-standing notion of Asia-Pacific by extending Asia-Pacific westwards to include India, implying that actually the Indian Ocean region and the Asia-Pacific should be seen as one integrated theater where great power politics is panning out, right? So when it comes to Western Hemisphere, right? Western Hemisphere is going to expand the theater eastward to span the entirety of the Pacific Ocean, right? And despite the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, what happens in the Western Hemisphere, embodied in the introduction of the Donroe Doctrine, will have profound implications on international relations and power politics and power dynamics in these parts of the world, right? So I think from the China's perspective, right, the introduction of the Donroe Doctrine and the recent shift in the paradigm informing the U.S. foreign policy at large is the result of fundamental recalibration of the U.S. foreign policy and fundamental reconstruction of Americans' understanding of America's role in the global order influx. So, and from China's perspective, the introduction of the Donroe Doctrine actually reflects America's shifted foreign policy due to structural competition and domestic pressure. And let me elaborate a bit more on this. So I think from China's perspective, the introduction of the Donroe Doctrine actually represents a fundamental ideological foundation of U.S. foreign policy. Actually, earlier versions of the Donroe Doctrine was known as a Monroe Doctrine, right? But Donroe Doctrine is not simply a revival of this 19th century concept. Actually, earlier versions of the Monroe Doctrine were typically presented in terms of defending republicanism, opposing colonialism, and protecting the political integrity and independence of then newly established countries in the Americas. And later on, this narrative shifted to highlight shared hemispheric identity, shared economic prosperity, and shared security. But Donroe Doctrine is quite different from earlier versions. And Donroe Doctrine has stripped away this entire value facade of this foreign policy. Basically, the Donroe Doctrine articulates the Americas as a region where the United States has exclusive hegemony, where influence and presence of other major powers should withdraw, and the United States reserve unchallenged, unconstrained, and unparalleled right and capability to intervene decisively. So from China's perspective, the shift from Monroe Doctrine to Donroe Doctrine represents the shift of the justification of American hegemony on the basis of value to one that is based on very raw power politics and geopolitical assertion, right? And from China's perspective, the shift from Monroe Doctrine to Donroe Doctrine is not a sign of strength, but a sign of weakness. The United States was supposed to be a global hegemon. By definition, all parts of the world should be the so-called backyards of a global hegemon. But if you read the Donroe Doctrine, and if you read the 2025 National Security Strategy, and if you read the 2026 National Defense Strategy, all these point to a reorientation in the United States foreign policy and strategic planning. The Western Hemisphere, right? The America's so-called own backyard, own region, have been prioritized over other regions, including Indo-Pacific and North Atlantic, right? North Atlantic. So I think basically what the Trump administration is telling friends and allies in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe is that you have to step up your own defense spending, you have to ramp up your own defense capabilities while reorienting their own, America's own resources and attention to the Western Hemisphere, right? Western Hemisphere. And actually, from the perspective of China, this is a sign of weakness because the Donroe Doctrine has emerged at a time when the United States is confronting a cocktail of crises at home, including political polarization, trade imbalances, social ethnic tensions, fiscal overblown, and strategic overstretch. So from China's perspective, the Donroe Doctrine represents America's hegemonic consolidation in its own near border at the expense of its commitment in other parts of the world, even for a region as consequential and as important as the Indo-Pacific region and Europe. And actually the relative demotion or the deprioritization of Indo-Pacific and Europe vis-à-vis the Western Hemisphere also derived from the fact that the United States is reconstructing its understanding of international security. And I see an interesting parallel here between China and the United States. For those of you who are familiar with Chinese security outlook, you will understand that China's understanding of security is layered. It's best depicted by three concentric circles. The innermost circle is what we call national security, right? Captured by our president's articulation of the so-called holistic national security outlook we call 总体国家安全观 in Chinese, right? And the middle circle is what we call neighborhood security. And we emphasize security in China's neighborhood, in Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, and so on and so forth. And we have formulated initiatives like neighborhood community with shared future, and we have articulated the so-called Asian security outlook to substantiate our understanding of neighborhood security. And the outer ring, the outer circle, is the global security, right? Our president has articulated the Global Security Initiative, in which we have promoted notions like common security, sustainable security, and indivisible security, and so on and so forth. Right? We have three layers: national security, neighborhood security, and global security. And I see the United States under Donald Trump, under the Donroe Doctrine, is pivoting towards this layered structure of international security, right? Of greatest importance to the Trump administration, whether it's first term or the second term, is homeland security, right? If you read NSS and DS, you see, according to American rhetoric, the core national security issues of the United States concerns border security, right? Immigration issues and the so-called narco-terrorism and so on and so forth, instead of the so-called threats posed by China, right? China is not identified as an active adversary or the pacing threat, according to some analysts. Instead, China is identified as a potentially hostile nation, right? That's potentially hostile, not an active one, right? And the so-called risks and threats posed by Russia has also been downplayed, right? So a lot of languages have been organized around protecting the homeland. Right. Then on the basis of homeland security, right, the next layer for the United States is hemispheric security. Right? In that sense, under the Donroe Doctrine, the United States is extending America First agenda as one of America's first. Right? Increasingly, issues in Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere, have been framed as an extension of United States domestic America First agenda, right? Agenda. And what happens in the Western Hemisphere is seen as an extension of America's homeland security. And actually, Donald Trump, right, Donald Trump is, under Donald Trump, I think the US policy towards the Latin America is going to be even more coercive, aggressive, predatory in the future, right? In the future, because Donroe Doctrine, according to Donroe Doctrine, the United States is going to enjoy monopoly in terms of hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And unlike the classic Monroe Doctrine, the 19th century Monroe Doctrine was directed at safeguarding against European colonial influence, and the contemporary Donroe Doctrine is about preventing countries like China and Russia from taking part in affairs in the region. And the United States is not just preventing China and or Russia from gaining the strategic footholds in Latin America. Right? The United States is going to lock China out of the Western Hemisphere. Right? Basically, the United States is warning regional countries not to enjoy very intimate economic relations with China. And the United States is going to resort to, I think, economic sanctions. The United States is going to construct exclusive digital ecosystems to lock China out. Basically, you have to choose side between China and the United States in the Western Hemisphere, right? Western Hemisphere. So, homeland security, hemispheric security, and global security. Donald Trump is not very interested in global security unless there is something there for the United States or for himself, such as the Nobel Peace Prize. Otherwise, he's not going to intervene, right? So you see a convergence between the international security outlook between China and the United States as epitomized by the Donroe Doctrine. So as Dr. Titina has mentioned, China's response to the Donroe Doctrine, China's response to epic fury, right, have been measured, constrained, right? So basically, China refrained from engaging in very direct, open confrontation vis-à-vis the United States. China is not undertaking any moves that directly challenge American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. Instead, China exercised pragmatism, right, and engage in a very flexible way. I think China's response has been two-pronged. Diplomatically, China criticized, right? There is a war of words. China criticized the American special military operations and military attack as inconsistent with international law, inconsistent with the basic fundamental rules as enshrined in the UN Charter, and depicting America as an international bully, violating the basic notion of sovereignty, right? But economically, China is doubling down on economic engagement with countries in the Western Hemisphere. Actually, in December 2025, not after the release of the National Security Strategy, China released its third white paper on China's relations with Latin American countries and the Caribbean. In this white paper, China actually stressed the importance of economic partnership without political conditionalities. China emphasized the importance of South-South cooperation and so on and so forth, and China pledged to step up a relationship with Latin American countries in relation to trade integration, to infrastructure development, and development cooperation. And in this white paper, China also alluded to the utility of some policy instruments to hedge against geopolitical risks, such as greater use of local currencies to settle trade in energy and commodity trade. So overall, China is doubling down on economic partnership with Latin American countries, and in this way, China is trying to present itself as a benign power whose interest is rooted in long-term common economic prosperity in Latin America as opposed to short-term geopolitical calculus. And I think China exercises restraint also because China draws a few very sober lessons from the Donroe Doctrine as well as the American attack on Iran. I think China realized that actually there's a limit to China's capability when it comes to power projection. Right? Power projection. China realized that Panama and Venezuela are just simply too far away from China, right? Too far away from China. China is not in a position to defend our partners from home, so far away from home. Actually, China has been operating the Panama Canal for quite some time, and China enjoys very close partnership with Venezuela, and China invested billions in Venezuela. And we have a so-called all-weather partnership with Venezuela, but we realized that when the United States moved on Panama, forcing the countries to withdraw from the Belt and Road Initiative, when the United States moved against President Maduro to seize him and his wife, there's little militarily that China can do, right? Can do. So this is, I think, to some extent, the Donroe Doctrine is a wake-up call for China. Right? China has come to terms with the fact that years, if not decades, of engagement, investment, and influence can be wiped out overnight by American hard power, by American military power. And what happened in the Western Hemisphere is also indicative of the fact that the scope of China, US-China competition has become global in nature, right? Global in nature. And actually, because of China's going out campaign, because China's Belt and Road Initiative, China's overseas interests have been scattered across the globe, spread across the globe. But when it comes to the safety of China's expansive overseas interest, their safety are very uncertain. And the safety of China's overseas interests are vulnerable to American coercion and more assertive means of projecting their interest. So in that sense, I think what China needs to do is not to confront. Is not to confront the United States, but to strengthen itself, right? To make to put China, to put ourselves in a position to defend our interests more assertively, right? I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chi. Really, I find it remarkable that U.S. hard power projection is considered paramount, that China may be biding its time or thinking that its capabilities are limited. I want to just we have the next 25 minutes or so for honest participation, free-flowing conversation. I want to pose just quick questions to the panelists, and then you can also respond to what the others have said in a minute or two, and so we can have some audience conversation. Dr. Chi, is this an eventual kind of quid pro quo? I like how you have put up this analytical frame of China's three concentric circles of security outlook: national security, neighborhood, and global. And it's analogous to maybe the U.S., homeland security, and then the Western Hemisphere, and the broader global security. But if China concedes on Panama, Venezuela, whatever, in Latin America, Western Hemisphere, and even restrains itself on the responses, reactions to the Iran attack, is there an implicit kind of quid pro quo that when it's China's turn to deal with its own neighborhood security, that China would expect the U.S. to stay out? If the U.S. can have monopoly and exclusivity of the Western Hemisphere dominance, then would China feel entitled to have a similar kind of a dominance in the Indo-Pacific? So that's just a quick question, Dr. G. And then Ajahn Paul, you can say if you have a response to this doesn't look good, doesn't sound good for ASEAN to me. But if you want to have a little bit of intervention about that, in this kind of U.S.-China mix, how should ASEAN maybe navigate? And then Ambassador Godek, you mentioned a little bit about the post-Trump 2. You alluded to maybe you get a new president. I would imagine that in the U.S., and I can see some arguments there already within the Republican Party, the Iran attack is not in the national security strategy script. In the national security, the NSS and NDS, they have these 5 regions, in sequence. The first is the dominance of the Western Hemisphere, and then they talk about the Indo-Pacific, and then they talk about European civilization, and then the Middle East was 4th, and then Africa is the 5th. So suddenly now they have this attack in the Middle East wars, front and center. Is this long-lasting? What's happening? And in the U.S., I see that Vice President Vance is not part of this conversation, and he's not in the news a lot. And I sense that there's some disagreements about, it's not America first. America first and making America great again is not to fight an kind of a ambiguous, very lethal and powerful war, but the objective is a little bit unclear. What are we to make of this, Ambassador Godek? So maybe, Dr. G, just a minute or two, if you can respond. Is China expecting something here? If the U.S., if it's being mild and moderate and modest now, does it expect its own turn? And then Ajahn Paul and then Ambassador Godek.
Thank you, Dr. Titinan, for these very challenging questions. I think I just want to go back to Ambassador Godek's initial remarks. Right, the international system is under strain because major powers have gone rogue. Right, Russia, China, and the United States. But actually, if you compare China's behavior with those of the United States and Russia, all these criticisms that you levy against China, industrial subsidy, flouting on international trade rules, South China Sea, actually China's ambition have been constrained within China's borders. Right, compared to what happened to the United States vis-à-vis Venezuela, Iran, what happened to Russia vis-à-vis Ukraine. So China's ambition has been constrained. China has always been a constrained power. And actually, China has no ambition. China has no territorial ambitions. China has never invaded. The PRC has never invaded. PRC has never occupied foreign territories. So in that sense, China is not seeking exclusive hegemonic ambitions in Southeast Asia or in the neighborhood. And Dr. Titinan also alluded to U.S.-China quid pro quo accommodating each other's core interests. I think that's the reality of international relations. If you look at the order of the post-war political order, that reflected a compromise between the United States and then Soviet Union, and when it comes to the post-World War economic order, that reflected a compromise and a consensus between the United States and Great Britain. And nowadays, I think the global balance of power implies that the United States and China have to reach some compromise to safeguard the global stability, and to rewrite the rules governing global politics and world economy. And when it comes to the restraint that China exercised, I think also China draws a lesson from the collapse of the Soviet Union. Right? According to China's understanding of the failure of the Soviet Union collapsed from within, right? Not because of international pressure. In that sense, China is waiting for the United States to go crazy, to go vogue, so that the United States is going to crack from within, right? Then China is just waiting for the American empire to collapse. Right. I stop here. Thank you.
Ajahn Paul, should we be concerned now, with these dynamics, South China Sea, would China then consider this to be its own backyard? And the Mekong region.
Well, yes. Overall, I think the Donroe Doctrine, we have been hearing about this, China's softened tone toward China because you just want to focus on the Latin America, the American continents. But I think if you look into the broader perspective, U.S. hemispheric, approach toward its interests, you can't discard the fact that the U.S. interest in the Pacific is still stable. In the sense that, you have Hawaii over there, you have Guam over there, and then you have the first island chains, right, which the U.S. has been identified as the key important national security interest. And even though it's not like in the Western Hemispheric interest of the U.S. as the Donroe Doctrine perhaps suggests, probably that's the terms that might, make us kind of like understand. But I think Asia Pacific, especially in Western Pacific, until the first island chain is still under the U.S. radar at certain points. So but the dilemma for ASEAN itself is that, how to deal with the unpredictabilities that I was mentioning earlier, whether or not of course, it's not like the priority at the moment. But in the future, if anything happened in South China Sea, or if any whatever aggressive behavior, if anyone predict that China would do in South China Sea or in Mekong sub-region, which I don't think China would do, that policy response, that ASEAN needs to prepare is unclear, right? I think the other day we have the speakers from the Hudson Institute. I also agree with him. John Lee, he was mentioning about this. There are some partner U.S. allies and partners in these regions that do well and not doing so well in the regions. I think Northeast Asia kind of adjusts these policies quite actively, quite effectively, in the sense that Japan responds to U.S. pressures on increasing defense spending, Korea, whatsoever, and Taiwan. But Southeast Asia, we are still in limbo, in the sense that our policies is still quite lag behind, in the sense that we can't really identify what's going to happen in the next couple of years. Probably the nature of this region itself, that a lot of U.S. partners and allies are not very committal to the security relationship. So, for example, Thailand, as you and I normally criticize that Thailand is unreliable partners of the U.S., and then that comes to the point where some ASEAN country might have this dilemma to formulate the proper policies in response to the U.S. Changing role here. Partly because they don't really know what was going to happen exactly with the South China Sea, and the U.S. are going to try to protect itself. But if you look into the broader perspective that I was mentioning earlier, that it's still in the U.S. radar. But it's just the uncertainties about whether or not the U.S. is going to come here and protect the interests. If, for example, the Taiwan's issue erupt in the future, that probably one of the problems. Probably I just.
Thank you, Ajahn Paul. Ambassador Godek, is what we see in the U.S., is it a trajectory, a continuing trajectory now, not just the Trump administration?
Thank you, Dr. Titnan. And it's a pleasure to hear the presentations and comments of my colleagues here on the panel. So thank you to both of them. Maybe a couple of points. I don't know how directly I'm going to answer your specific question, but I do want to make a couple of points. The first is this: I would be very careful about ascribing to the Trump administration's foreign policy any particular structure or long-term strategy, or characterizing things like the Donroe Doctrine as something that are permanent or long-lasting. I think the reality is that the administration President Trump is really the one who's making the key decisions, not all of them, because there are other centers of what, I hesitate to say power exactly, but there are other actors in the system that are making decisions and doing things. I would say that generally the policy is transactional, and it's day to day, and minute to minute it could change. And so I would discourage the idea that we should be looking at documents and drawing from those documents some sort of broader coherent strategy. The second point I would make is the Indo-Pacific is critical to the United States. And pretty much regardless of what may be happening in other regions, if U.S. core interests come under threat in the Indo-Pacific, then I think the United States government and President Trump will respond. We have extraordinary levels of trade. We obviously need any number of different things from this region economically, and we do have Hawaii out there in the middle of the Pacific, and we have lots of other reasons why I think that even in a foreign policy world where we're transactional, we're going to respond if it starts to touch a core American interest. There is no doubt that American foreign policy is in a period of transition, in upheaval. There are many reasons for this, and we could have a long discussion, maybe a separate seminar someday on American politics and foreign policy. It would be quite a fascinating discussion. It certainly could delve deep, not just into the policy broadly, but into Republican internal disputes and discussions about this, but Democratic Party politics and indeed more broadly. I think I would just say things are evolving very rapidly, and I would be hesitant to predict exactly what the future is going to be. Maybe the last point I'll make is that America First is a very vague term, because anybody can take the phrase America First and fill it with whatever content it wants, whatever content he or she wants to fill it with. When I used it in my speech, though, I was using it in the very specific, sense that if a core American interest is challenged, or if President Trump decides that something is a core American interest, then we're going to respond. And we're going to respond with American military power. Maybe I should just add on this point as well. I would agree that each of the three countries that I mentioned in my remarks, Russia, China, and the United States, have acted very differently and are acting very differently and doing very different things to undermine the international system, as I discussed. I do not share the view that China has not got some territorial ambitions. I think that many others would have the view that that China does in fact have some territorial ambitions. I would also just note that China's ability to project military power beyond its own borders is frankly a very recent development. And I certainly hope that it will not take any actions beyond those it's already taken, for example, in the South China Sea. But I don't think there's any guarantee of that, and I don't think anybody should assume it. And I think we all need to be very careful, and that's why we need an international system that puts some level of constraint and poses some sort of set of principles and values on all the nations of the world, not just the smaller ones. Thanks.
Thank you, and also we draw some relief that you say that things could change, and not to overread the documents. And so beyond the Trump 2, maybe things could change. The core interest of the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific, I think it's laid out also the first island chain, certainly. But then also there's some questions, in my mind, how many wars and conflicts can the U.S. fight at a given time? If they have this, it's a large number. They have a very powerful, it's the most powerful military in the world. It's been demonstrated. But then it is a question mark. If they do this, how can they rebuild the arsenal fast enough to fight more wars and conflicts? The floor is opened for questions, comments. We have a little bit of time. If there's any input here, please just tell us who you are first, and then ask your question or make your comment. Briefly.
Yeah. My name is Yerwood Ganok. Actually, I'm also, help a private think tank trying to build a geo-economic forum. That's why I have a special interest in the topics we discussed today. And first of all, I have to thank Dr. G for trying to, put out a framework that try to draw a parallel between what the U.S. do to the three layer of Chinese framework. But I personally doubt that there's such a coherent thought from the U.S. side, because it seemed to me that a lot of things that Trump has been doing is like, I don't know, it's like from the whim, right? And the America First or the so-called Donroe Doctrine is actually quite vague. I don't know who gives the definition of the so-called the Donroe Doctrine, right? It's sort of a new term that become popularized after Trump decided to kidnap the Maduro, right? And so the definition is still like fluid. But I have a question whether the so-called Donroe Doctrine is really a well thought of strategy, or it's like, just act out of the whim. And actually, I have three questions actually addressed to Ambassador Ambassador Godek. Whether first the so-called Donroe Doctrine is really a well thought of strategy, or is mostly out of the personal, personal whim or personal preference of President Trump. And second question is that the America First that Trump trying to promote, it seemed to me that it's not quite America First in a lot of sense, right? I just wonder why Trump think that he can make America to go it alone by trying to alienate the traditional U.S. allies as much as he can, right? Because to be a global hegemon, I do believe that you need alliance, you need allies, to make you one. But it seems that Trump tried his best to alienate the traditional allies of the U.S., threatening to take Greenland from Denmark, right? And the third question, this question is actually, I'm not trying to take side, right? But I'm sort of interested in terms of the strategic decision, whether the U.S., in particular Trump, make a blunder in this. Professor John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago, I think he has been advocating this for a long time, and he said that the U.S. make a strategic blunder of trying to just like Ajahn Titinan say that, how many wars that U.S. Can create at the same time, right? So whether the U.S. make the blunder in terms of not focusing only on China, but to create a lot of conflict around the world. Because according to him, according to this realist theory, the number one priority of the U.S. should be China. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very good set of questions. So, I mean, to what extent is all of this is President Trump centered? That's really something that we are thinking about a lot. There was another hand. I'll take another question or two, or comment. Anyone else? ท่านทูตกสิทธิ์ครับ Ambassador Kasit Pirom, also former Foreign Minister Kasit Pirom of Thailand. He's Foreign Minister back in 2008 to 2011.
Thank you. Apologies for being late. A fellow of ISIS. I have two questions. One is to all the panelists. What do you think of the Brazil's position in terms of Brazil being the biggest country in Latin America and a founder of the BRICS organization? Is it good to take everything lying down and not coming out to say something on behalf of the fellow Latin American countries, vis-à-vis what Donald Trump has been doing so far, bullying the Venezuelan and at the same time threaten Cuba, and most probably the rest of the Central America countries and so on. Wouldn't Brazil, under President Lula, would like to take the leadership role? That is the first question. Second, the fact that President Donald Trump wants to take over Canada and Greenland, is that part and parcel of a sort of the so-called forward defense concept within the context of global security interests of the United States? What do you think of that? And Ambassador Godet has said that what Trump has been doing at the moment, it is highly likely that it will be sustained. There will be changes with the new incoming American administration, the changes inside the Congress and so on. If that is the optimistic note, I'm all for it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other comment, question? Okay, in that case, let me go back to the panel. We have about 5 minutes. Can we start with Dr. G? And we'll come down this way, and Ambassador Godek can have the last word. Dr. G.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Dr. Titinan. I'm not sure which specific questions are directed to me, but I just share my thoughts on what has been offered to me in terms of comments. So on Brazil, I'm not an expert on Brazil. And I do agree with you that Brazil played a role in the formation of BRICS. But actually, to me, the group of BRICS is losing some luster, losing some relevance. If you look at which group of countries that best represent the developing and emerging economies, in the early 21st century, the BRICS were the group of countries that enjoy rapid economic growth, but nowadays, actually Russia is in war, Brazilian economy is facing a lot of uncertainty, and Brazil was subject to 50% tariff, right, from the United States, and South Africa has also lost some relevance when it comes to the world economy, right? Basically, the relative decline of BRICS is mirrored by the relative rise of ASEAN, right? If you are the global investors, I think the global investment community is betting on the future of ASEAN instead of BRICS countries. I think ASEAN represents a group of very dynamic and rapidly emerging economies. And on the forward-looking defense posture, I think we see some similarities and parallels between the foreign policy behavior of Washington, D.C. and Moscow. And China doesn't believe in forward-leaning defense posture. I think China's overall defense posture has been very inward-looking about self-defense. And I just want to pick up on the point about Ambassador Godek's point about America first. No one disagrees with the fact that one country should put their core national interest first, but what America first embody is a zero-sum mentality, right? America first sent messages that every country's own national interest can be achieved only at the expense of the losses of other countries, right? There's no positive sum game here. Everything is zero-sum. My game is your loss is my game, right? Vice versa. So in that sense, what China has been promoting is a more harmonious international relations, and China believes in win-win cooperation. China believes in mutual gains. China never has this rhetoric of China first, right? Always have a community with shared future. Right? I'll stop here.
I also agree with Dr. G on the role of Brazil. He was mentioning about the Chinese positions against these interventionist policies of the United States in other countries, and then Dr. G was saying somehow that China is not expecting to play global power militarily, distant from its own regions. I think in that sense, if you look into China and then Brazil, even though Brazil is there, But if you compare the military capabilities and all the capabilities that Brazil commands, I think Brazil, just like similar to China, show the positions, narrative against imperialist policies, and that probably what these middle power would be able to do. I don't think they would do anything more than that. And if you look at Donroe doctrines, a lot of people reiterate my point earlier that actually, if you look into the actions that Trump's administration has been doing, China is still the core of those actions in some way. Right, we were mentioning about the Chinese investments in Venezuela, and then what the U.S. has been doing is just like basically just to slash down the Chinese interests over there. In Iran, as you know, that Iran is like one of the partners of China, and then trying to do something with Iran that would affect Chinese interests anyway, in the Middle East. And even though the oil supply from Iran to China is not that much, in the other way around, but still, this Chinese influence, a growing influence outside Asia Pacific, has been curtailed, have been curbed by the U.S. interventionist policies. And the questions of why the U.S. can go alone. U.S. has been doing this for quite some time. Actually, this is not unprecedented, right? I mean, if you look from the end of the Cold War, the U.S. even did, went to Persian Gulf while trying to go alone and then trying to pressure other countries to support. 9/11 is another one, right? So that's not unprecedented in terms of unilateral actions. Is actually a key U.S. strategies from many decades. So I don't think that's strange.
Okay, thank you very much, John Paul. And Master Godek, I mean, is this an aberration? It's all about President Trump, and beyond him, maybe our situation will revert to a more the norm or what we used to be accustomed to.
I would not count on that. Maybe that will happen. Maybe just very quickly to kind of go through some of the questions that were asked to provide some level of response. Look, on the Donroe Doctrine, I'll just underscore again. I mean, obviously I've read what the national security strategy says. I've seen the actions that have been taken with respect to Venezuela or Panama Canal or other areas. Again, I do think that the Donroe Doctrine reflects certainly the reviews of some key administration officials, to include, most importantly, President Trump, but I don't think that I would count on it being implemented in exactly the same way, day after day, minute by minute. I think it could change. I think that it is one aspect of their way of thinking about certainly the region, the Western Hemisphere. The question about America first, why go it alone? You need allies. I mean, obviously, I would agree that the United States is going to be stronger. It has been stronger because of allies. I mean, in many respects, what has been unique about the United States across decades is that we had this system of alliances as part of this international system that allowed us to accomplish extraordinary things. And to kind of casually toss away these alliances strikes me as a serious mistake. It's not a good idea. But that is, in fact, what is in the process of happening. In terms of creating a lot of conflicts, in making China the #1 priority for the United States, look, my own view is that obviously China is critical for the United States. China has been rising for decades. It's a major economic power. It's a global economic power with growing military capabilities. I said, I do think China deserves a lot of attention and that we need to engage. And I am pleased to see the upcoming summit that will take place. I think that is a positive development. But it's certainly not the only thing that's going on in the world. It's not the only thing that the United States should pay attention to. And certainly I don't think that endless conflicts are a good idea. This question about kind of the US administration wanting Canada or Greenland as kind of forward defense spaces or something like that. I mean, that may be an aspect of it, that may be an aspect that some people are thinking about it, but I don't think those are fundamentally at the core of why President Trump is doing these things. I think, again, we could have a conversation about inside kind of thinking of certain communities in the United States and certain elements of the Republican Party. We could have discussions about why they have focused across time on places like Canada and Greenland. But I think that there are a number of reasons that have kind of driven this interest in those two areas. Canada is a country, of course, and Greenland, adjunct to Denmark. The evolution of American foreign policy is going to be complicated, and I think that we have 3 more years, a little bit less, of President Trump and the Trump administration foreign policy to go, and a lot is likely to happen in that period of time. I think that it is critical from my perspective that the rest of the world, particularly the middle powers, focus on ensuring that the international system, to include ultimately the big powers, are acting out of principle and, frankly, doing things that are in the interest of people everywhere, and that first principles are being followed. Dr. T just said, of course, that America First has got a specific meaning. I would agree with, I think, the assessment that America First has come to some degree to mean America alone. I would not agree that China's trade policy or its actions in the South China Sea are positive. I think those also are in the sense of kind of China First foreign policy, if I might put it that way. But I do think that the rest of the world, Thailand, ASEAN, the middle powers, countries everywhere, have a profound interest in ensuring that the system that we have in place internationally, to some degree, holds countries to account, that there is a system of free trade, that sovereignty is protected, that there is attention being paid to human rights abuses and threats to fundamental freedoms. These things are important, and I would encourage ASEAN and Thailand and people everywhere to focus on these things first. It is of interest to talk about specific actions and specific things that are happening in the world. Obviously, we need to do that, but we also need to focus on the future and building a better future.
Thank you, Ambassador Godek. Look, geopolitical interests are being contested in the geoeconomic arena. So the next session, we will look at the geoeconomics of the ASEAN-China of the region. Please join me in thanking our speakers, Dr. Ji Senpai, Dr. Pongpisut Busabarat, and Ambassador Robert Godek. Please join me in thanking them. We will now take a 10-minute break and reconvene for the geoeconomics session.